In the 10,000 years since the Emperor ascended to the Golden Throne, no one had dared speak the words aloud. Not Malcador, the Sigillite, who had held the throne himself and nearly died for it. Not the High Lords of Terra, who had ruled in the Emperor's name while growing fat on his silence. Not the countless saints and martyrs who had burned for his glory, or the billions of soldiers who had died with his name on their lips. The idea was simply too enormous, too dangerous, too fundamentally shattering to the architecture of human civilization to be spoken without consequence. Roboute Guilliman spoke it anyway. He stood in the Sanctum Imperialis, alone save for a handful of Adeptus Custodes who had escorted him here at his own request. The air tasted of ozone and ancient incense, of 10 millennia of accumulated prayer and grief compressed into something almost physical. The light was golden and wrong, emanating not from any fixture, but from the throne itself, that vast, terrible machine altar that kept a god alive and a species breathing. The Emperor looked, as he always looked, like a man being slowly consumed by his own divinity. The armor of gold had long since fused with atrophied flesh. The face, if it could still be called that, was a ruin of transcendence, something that had burned so hot for so long that only the impression of a human being remained. Tubes and cables cascaded from the throne like mechanical roots, drinking deep from the geomantic webwork beneath Terra, channeling the psychic screams of 1,000 freshly slaughtered psychers every single day. Guilliman looked at his father for a long time. If you crave stories of impossible choices and the men who make them in the darkest of all millennia, smash that subscribe button. The Emperor protects those who bear witness to what comes next. He had been resurrected by Eldar sorcery and his father's indirect will, stitched back into a universe he barely recognized, handed command of a war machine that had forgotten what it was built for. He had read the reports. All of them. The corruption in the administratum ran so deep that entire subsectors had been functionally independent for centuries, paying tithe in name only. The Ecclesiarchy had accumulated military power that rivaled some chapter fleets. The Inquisition had become a law unto itself so thoroughly that its various factions had begun quietly purging each other. And the High Lords, those 12 figures who ostensibly governed in the Emperor's name, were politicians first, servants of humanity a very distant second. He had tried reform. He had issued the Indomitus Crusade. He had written writs, signed proclamations, reorganized supply chains, and personally executed 3 High Lords for corruption so brazen it had bordered on performance. He had done everything a Lord Commander could do. It hadn't been enough. It would never be enough. Because at the end of every argument, every resistance to his reforms, every act of institutional sabotage from entrenched power, the answer was always the same. The Emperor's will supersedes yours, Lord Commander. And since the Emperor could not speak, could not confirm or deny, and could not reach down from that golden ruin and clarify his intentions, anyone could claim to speak for him. Everyone did. Guilliman pressed one gauntleted hand against the base of the throne. The metal was warm. It was always warm. "I have waited," he said quietly, "for you to give me another way." The throne hummed. Somewhere deep in the palace, a psyker died to keep the Astronomicon burning. "There isn't one," he straightened. The armor of fate, that extraordinary shell of ceramite and history, caught the golden light and threw it back, doubled. You built an Imperium on faith because faith was what humanity needed to survive. But faith without reason has become the disease, Father. They worship the corruption because it wears your face. I cannot fight that with logic. I cannot fight it with law. He paused. I can only fight it with legitimacy. He turned from the throne and walked toward the great doors of the sanctum, each footstep a measured declaration. The custodes watched him with expressions unreadable behind their golden helms. They had sworn oaths to the Emperor. They had not, technically, sworn oaths to the institution that had grown around him like a tumor swears itself to a host. Guilliman stopped at the threshold. "Summon the High Lords," he said. "Summon the Fabricator General, summon the Master of the Administratum and the Ecclesiarch." He did not look back. "Summon everyone who believes they speak for my Father." He stepped through the doors into the vast corridors of the Imperial Palace, where 100 staff officers and aides immediately moved to intercept him with vox slates and tactical reports and the 10,000 urgent demands of a galaxy at war. "Tell them," he said, loud enough that his voice carried the full, resonant authority of a Primarch who had commanded legions and written the book, literally, on how to wage war, that the Lord Commander of the Imperium wishes to inform them of a change in his title. He did not smile. Roboute Guilliman rarely smiled. But there was something in his eyes as he strode through the golden corridors of Terra, something that looked, to those who knew history well enough to recognize it, like a man who had finally, after 10,000 years of accumulated grief, decided to stop asking permission. The proclamation went out at 600 Terran Standard Time, and broadcast simultaneously across every Vox channel, every pict screen, every administratum terminal, and every ecclesiarchal pulpit that the Lord Commander's office could reach, which was most of them. It was not a lengthy document. Guilliman had spent 40 years of subjective time writing the Codex Astartes, a text so comprehensive it had governed Space Marine doctrine for 10 millennia. He understood better than anyone that the most important words were the ones that didn't need explaining. The proclamation was 11 sentences long. The first 3 established legal precedent, citing 17 separate clauses in imperial law regarding succession, emergency powers, and the authority vested in the Emperor's direct bloodline during periods of existential crisis. Guilliman had spent 3 weeks finding those clauses. They had always been there, buried beneath centuries of legislative sediment, quietly forgotten by high lords who had preferred a governing structure where no one had ultimate authority, because ultimate authority was dangerous to those who profited from the gaps. The next 4 sentences outline the immediate practical changes to imperial governance. The High Lords would remain as an advisory council. The Ecclesiarchy would retain its spiritual function. The Administratum would continue its administrative role. All of them would now report to a single executive authority rather than operating as autonomous power blocks answerable only to tradition and inertia. The final 4 sentences were the ones that cracked the galaxy. In the absence of direct imperial guidance, and in recognition of the existential threat facing all of humanity, I, Roboute Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines, Lord Commander of the Imperium, and son of the Emperor of Mankind, do hereby assume the title and responsibilities of Emperor Regent, with full executive authority over all arms of imperial governance until such time as the Emperor himself resumes direct command or designates an alternative succession. This is not a claim of divinity. This is not a repudiation of the Emperor's sovereignty. This is a recognition that an Imperium without a functioning head has been dying for 10,000 years, and that death ends today. Let all who serve humanity acknowledge this transition. Let all who oppose it understand that opposition to the survival of our species is itself the greatest heresy. Ave Imperator, Ave Humanitas. Asterisk. The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then the Imperium erupted. On Terra itself, the reaction was volcanic. In the great Ministorum Cathedral of the Astronomican's light, Cardinal Mephiston Vrail, a man so devoted to the Emperor's divinity that he had reportedly flagellated himself into unconsciousness 17 times in acts of penance, read the proclamation twice, set it down carefully on his altar, and then overturned the altar with both hands. His congregation watched in stunned silence as a man who preached composure as holy virtue screamed for his secretaries and began dictating the Ecclesiarchy's response with a speed and fury that suggested he had been preparing for this exact moment his entire career. Perhaps he had. The Ecclesiarchy had spent 10,000 years consolidating power in the Emperor's name. The emergence of someone who could legitimately challenge that name was their oldest institutional nightmare. In the Senatorum Imperialis, the High Lords convened an emergency session that devolved into something approximating chaos within 6 minutes. Lord Militant Tetrarchus, commanding officer of the Astra Militarum's Terran Defense Forces, sat very still throughout the shouting and studied a tactical map of the Imperial Palace with the quiet intensity of a man doing mathematics he didn't like the answers to. The Fabricator General of Mars, present via hololithic projection from the Red Planet, said nothing for the first 40 minutes and then offered a single, characteristically inscrutable statement that his consultations with the Omnissiah were ongoing. 3 High Lords demanded Guilliman's immediate arrest. 2 quietly sent personal Vox messages to Ultramar. 1 excused himself to use the facilities and was not seen again for several days. Across the broader Imperium, the proclamation traveled at the speed of the Astronomican, which is to say, unevenly, unpredictably, and with a particular distortion that the warp applied to all human communication. Some worlds received it within hours, others would not learn for months. A few, deep in the Noctis Aeterna's shadow, might never receive it clearly at all, the signal fragmenting into static and half-heard whispers that their ecclesiarchal priests would interpret according to their existing convictions. But the worlds that heard it clearly had to choose. In Ultramar, the response was immediate and unsurprising. 500 worlds that had been rebuilt by Guilliman's personal attention, that had been governed according to his principles, that had bled alongside him in the Indomitus Crusade. They acclaimed the proclamation with the fervor of people who had already been living in the prototype of what he was now proposing for the whole Imperium. Vox channels from Macragge to Eax rang with approval that sounded, to suspicious ears in the Ministorum, disturbingly like organized celebration rather than spontaneous relief. That suspicion was not entirely unfounded. Guilliman had not made this decision yesterday. He had made it incrementally over years of frustration, and he had spent those years quietly ensuring that the people most likely to support him were positioned where their support would matter most. The Indomitus Crusade had not only pushed back the forces of chaos, it had distributed Primaris Space Marines, loyal to Guilliman's vision of what Space Marines should be, across hundreds of chapters. It had placed capable, reform-minded commanders in key military positions. It had, in short, been both a military campaign and a very long political groundwork. Not everyone had noticed. The High Lords had been too busy fighting each other to pay attention to what the Lord Commander was building beneath their feet. They were noticing now. The first open declaration of opposition came not from the Ecclesiarchy, whose response was still being drafted with theological precision, but from a single Space Marine chapter. The Soul Drinkers, reconstituted after their near annihilation and deeply suspicious of any centralized authority, broadcast a terse, two-line vox on an open channel monitored by half the segmentum solar. We did not survive 10,000 years of imperial betrayal to kneel to a new throne. The Codex Astartes does not recognize the authority of emperors who walk and breathe. It was a small thing. One chapter, a few thousand warriors. But in the silence of the Senatorum Imperialis, when that transmission was read aloud, 3 High Lords smiled for the first time all morning. And Guilliman, reading the same transmission in his personal strategium, made a note to have a very direct conversation with the Soul Drinkers chapter master at the earliest opportunity. Direct, in the Primarch's current vocabulary, covered a considerable range of options. The Astra Militarum had always been the Imperium's spine, not its heart. That belonged to the Emperor, or to the faith that had grown around him like coral around a shipwreck. Not its mind. That was the Administratum's contested territory. Though calling the Administratum a mind was generous to the point of insult. The Guard was the spine, the long, unglamorous structural column that held everything upright through sheer mass and stubbornness, absorbing blows that would have shattered anything more elegant. 63 hours after the proclamation, General Argenthus Valorian of the Cadian shock troops, or what remained of them, reconstituted across a dozen successor regiments after Cadia's fall, called a meeting of senior officers in the strategium of his command vessel, the Unbroken Litany, currently in high orbit above Terra. He had served the Imperium for 41 years. He had fought on 19 worlds. He had personally witnessed 3 separate Chaos incursions, 1 Tyranid splinter fleet, and an Orc of sufficient size to briefly block out a star. He was not a man given to existential crisis. He was, however, a man given to clarity. "I'm going to say what everyone in this room is thinking," he said, without preamble, to the assembled colonels and commissars seated around the strategium table. "And then we're going to decide, as soldiers, what we do about it." The room was quiet. Outside the viewport, Terra hung in its shroud of orbital traffic and defensive satellites, ancient and enormous, the weight of human history compressed into a single scarred world. "We swore oaths to the Emperor," Valorian said. "Every one of us. Oaths to serve, to fight, to die if necessary in his name. Those oaths are the foundation of everything we are. Without them, we're just armed men on a boat." He paused. "The question, the only question that matters right now, is whether those oaths bind us to a man on a throne who hasn't spoken in 10,000 years, or to the survival of the species that throne was built to protect. Commissar General Eloise Tark, seated at his right hand, was a woman whose reputation for ideological inflexibility had preceded her across 3 segmentums. She had personally executed soldiers for lesser heresies than the question Valorian had just asked aloud. She sat very still for a long moment. "The Lex Imperialis," she said finally, "recognizes the authority of direct bloodline succession in extremis. I checked this morning. The clause is obscure, but it is legitimate." She set her hands flat on the table. "I do not say this as an endorsement. I say it as a legal observation." "Legal observations from a commissar," Colonel Draven Heth of the Valhallan 18th muttered. "That's new." "Everything is new," Tark said flatly. "That's rather the point." The debate that followed lasted 11 hours. It was not clean or simple. These were soldiers shaped by an institution that had always answered the question of loyalty with violence, that had executed men for asking exactly the kinds of questions now filling the strategium like smoke. Some officers argued from faith. The Emperor's divinity was axiomatic, and any claim to supersede his authority was heresy, regardless of legal precedent or bloodline. Some argued from pragmatism. The Imperium was visibly failing, and a functioning executive authority was better than a committee of squabbling high lords. A few argued from something quieter and harder to name, a bone-deep exhaustion with dying for a system that had stopped working before their grandfathers were born. By the end of the 11th hour, the Cadian successor regiments, those hard-bitten, grief-forged soldiers who had watched their world die and kept fighting anyway, were split almost exactly down the middle. Valorian looked at that split and understood what it meant, not just for his regiments, for the Astra Militarum as a whole, replicated across 10,000 worlds and 1,000,000 separate commands, each one conducting its own version of this same agonized calculation. He made his decision. "We do not declare for either side," he said. "Not yet. We maintain operational readiness, and we wait for clarification from the Lord, from the Emperor Regent." The pause before the new title was barely perceptible. If his governance produces results, if the Imperium stabilizes and the enemies of mankind are pushed back, then the question of theology becomes secondary to the question of survival. If it does not, we reassess. It was not a heroic declaration. It would not be remembered in any regimental hymnal, but it was the decision of a man who understood that the Astra Militarum firing on itself was the single outcome that would guarantee humanity's extinction regardless of who sat on what throne. Commissar General Tark recorded the decision in her official log with the careful neutrality of someone who was also, privately, relieved. Not all commands were so measured. 3 regiments currently stationed in the Segmentum Obscurus declared outright for the Ecclesiarchy within 48 hours, their commanding officers issuing statements so theologically dense they were practically sermons. 2 regiments in Ultramar declared for Guilliman with an enthusiasm that suggested they'd been waiting for permission. And on the hive world of Necromunda, a guard garrison commander by the name of Praetor Solus Vane did something that no one had expected and very few people would admit made a certain kind of sense. He declared for neither Guilliman nor the Ecclesiarchy, announced that Necromunda would govern itself in the Emperor's name without external interference, and began quietly fortifying his position. He was, by most estimations, not going to be the last. The fracture lines weren't just theological. They were running along every existing fault in imperial society, between old power and new authority, between faith and function, between those who had benefited from the old order and those who had been ground beneath it. Guilliman's proclamation hadn't created those fault lines. They had always been there, invisible beneath the surface of imperial unity, maintained by a shared mythology that everyone had agreed, by unspoken consensus, not to examine too closely. He had simply been the first person with sufficient authority to stop pretending they didn't exist. In his strategium, deep in the imperial palace, surrounded by hololithic displays showing the emerging schism in real time, red for opposition, gold for support, Segre for the vast uncertain middle, Guilliman studied the map with the focused calm of a man who had wargamed this exact scenario. He had expected the split. He had modeled it, planned for it, built contingencies around it. The Astra Militarum's fracture was within projected parameters. The Ecclesiarchy's response was running slightly faster than anticipated, but well within manageable bounds. The High Lord's paralysis was exactly as predicted. What he had not fully modeled, what his centuries of strategic genius had perhaps underweighted because it was, fundamentally, not a military variable, was the faith. Not institutional faith, not the Ecclesiarchy's political theology, but the raw, personal, desperate faith of ordinary human beings who had survived impossible darkness by holding on to one single belief: that the Emperor was watching, that their suffering had meaning, that the golden light on the throne meant someone divine was still, in some fundamental way, in charge. He saw it in the reports from hive cities across Terra, not riots, not yet, but gatherings. Spontaneous, unorganized crowds assembling outside Ministorum temples in numbers that the Arbits were watching with careful attention. Men and women who worked the fabrication lines and the waste reclamation plants and the endless administrative machinery of the throne world, standing together in the cold Terran air, holding candles or lumen globes, or, in some cases, simply their empty hands raised toward a sky they couldn't see. Praying. Not to Guilliman, not against him, just praying, with the particular urgency of people who needed to be reassured that the universe still made sense. Guilliman looked at those reports for a long time. He had not claimed divinity. He had been explicit about that, because the claim would have been not just false, but counterproductive. A god emperor who could be wounded, who ate meals and slept, and expressed frustration in terms that his staff had learned to recognize as profanity filtered through architectural critique, was a poor replacement for a transcendent divine figure. He was not trying to replace the Emperor's divinity. He was trying to replace the Emperor's governance. The distinction, he was beginning to understand, was one that a significant portion of humanity was not equipped to make. Not because they were stupid, because they had been taught for 10,000 years that the two things were inseparable. That was going to be the hardest war he had ever fought. Not the Ecclesiarchy, not the dissenting chapters, not the High Lords or the Rogue Guard commanders, or the 1,000 other institutional challenges already crystallizing across the galaxy. The hardest war was going to be fought in the hearts of ordinary people who needed their universe to make sense. He pulled up the next report. Chaos activity in the segmentum solar had increased by 17% in the 36 hours since the proclamation. The ruinous powers, it seemed, were paying attention. The Ecclesiarchy had survived the age of apostasy. It had survived Sebastian Thor's reformation, the reign of blood, the systematic dismantling of its private armies, and 10,000 years of institutional pressure from every direction. It had survived because it understood, with the particular clarity of an organization whose entire purpose was the management of human belief, that faith was not merely a spiritual phenomenon. Faith was power. Faith was the most durable substance in the known universe, more resilient than adamantium, more destructive than a cyclonic torpedo, and infinitely more difficult to manufacture or destroy once it had taken root in sufficient numbers of human hearts. Ecclesiarch Theodoric Salvator IV had understood this since he was a novitiate scrubbing floors in a Ministorum temple on Ophelia VII. He had risen through the ranks of the Adeptus Ministorum, not through military genius or administrative brilliance, but through a profound and unsentimental understanding of how belief worked, how it could be shaped, directed, amplified, and when necessary, weaponized. He was 73 years old, physically unimpressive, and possessed of a mind that several inquisitors had privately compared to a steel trap wrapped in velvet. He had been preparing his response to Guilliman's proclamation for 6 days before it was issued, not because he had advance intelligence, though his network of confessors and shrine priests across the Imperium was formidable, but because he had been preparing for this eventuality for 11 years, since the moment Guilliman had been resurrected and it had become clear that the Lord Commander was not the grateful, compliant figurehead that the Ecclesiarchy had briefly hoped for. The formal declaration came on the 7th day after the proclamation, delivered simultaneously from every major Ministorum cathedral across the Imperium's core worlds. It was, by any measure, a masterpiece of theological construction, a document that managed to express absolute, unbending opposition to Guilliman's claim, while never once directly naming him as a heretic, a formulation that gave the Ecclesiarchy legal and political flexibility while landing on its audience with the full emotional weight of excommunication. The key passage, the one that would be quoted and carved into temple walls and whispered in Hive City alleyways for generations, read, "No man, however mighty, however blessed by blood or battle, may place himself between the faithful and their God Emperor. To claim the Emperor's authority while the Emperor lives is not governance. It is usurpation. It is, in the eyes of the Ecclesiarchy and in the sight of the immortal God Emperor of mankind, the most profound act of spiritual arrogance that this millennium has yet produced. We do not call for violence. We call for clarity. We call for the Lord Commander to return to his proper station. We call for the faithful to pray, to witness, and to remember that the Emperor's silence is not absence. It is patience." The final line was Salvator's personal contribution, added at the last moment, and it was the line that kept Guilliman awake that night, reading intelligence reports. The Emperor has always chosen his instruments carefully. Let us pray that he chooses now." It was, Guilliman recognized, a declaration of war conducted entirely in the grammar of peace. Salvatore was not calling for the Frateris militia to march on the palace. He was not issuing a direct call to arms. He was doing something considerably more dangerous. He was positioning the Ecclesiarchy as the patient, righteous party, the faithful shepherds waiting for divine correction of a wayward son, while simultaneously planting in every believer's mind the suggestion that divine correction might be forthcoming and might, if the Emperor willed it, take a physical form. He was, in short, creating permission for violence without ever issuing the order. The Adepta Sororitas complicated matters further. The Order's militant, those legendary warriors of the faith, the Sisters of Battle, whose burning faith translated literally into divine miracle, were not a monolith. The orders had their own internal politics, their own theological interpretations, their own relationship with the Ecclesiarchy's hierarchy that ranged from absolute doctrinal alignment to something that might charitably be described as respectful independence. Order of the Bloody Rose declared for the Ecclesiarchy, within 24 hours of Salvatore's statement, their canonist superior, issuing a response so fiery that several junior ministorum officials who read it in draft requested that certain passages be moderated before publication on the grounds that they constituted operational planning rather than theology. The request was denied. In Order of Our Martyred Lady took 3 days and then issued a statement of magnificent ambiguity that aligned with neither side while preserving the order's freedom of action. A response that satisfied no one and strategically positioned them precisely where their canonist superior had intended. Order of the Sacred Rose did something that no one had expected. Their canonist superior, a veteran of the Indomitus Crusade who had fought alongside Guilliman on 4 separate campaigns, requested a private audience with the Emperor Regent. She was granted it within hours. What passed between them was not recorded in any official document, though 3 separate inquisitorial agents attempted to find out and achieved varying degrees of failure. What was recorded was that the Order of the Sacred Rose subsequently issued no public statement at all, and that their Fortress Convent's void shield generators were quietly brought to full operational status. The Inquisition, characteristically, responded to the crisis by fracturing along its own internal fault lines with such thoroughness that it briefly became a microcosm of the broader imperial schism. Ordo Hereticus was, in theory, the most relevant body. Questions of heresy and doctrinal violation were their explicit mandate. In practice, this meant that every senior inquisitor in the Ordo Hereticus had a strong opinion, and no 2 opinions were identical. Several inquisitors declared the proclamation heretical and began assembling cases with the methodical intensity of their training. The several others declared that the proclamation was, if legally unusual, functionally necessary, and that pursuing it as heresy would itself constitute a dereliction of duty to humanity's survival. At least 2 inquisitors attempted to declare both positions simultaneously, and one submitted a formal request to convene a full conclave to adjudicate the matter, a process that would take approximately 18 months under normal circumstances. These were not normal circumstances, and Guilliman had approximately 18 months of patience for the process. He summoned the available senior inquisitors to the palace on the 9th day. Not to argue with them. He had learned enough about the Inquisition to know that argument was not a productive vector for changing inquisitorial minds. Instead, he placed before them a single hololithic display showing current chaos activity across the segmentum solar, now running at 23% above baseline. He showed them 3 separate intelligence reports from Ordo Malleus agents, confirming increased demonic incursion attempts at multiple points along the Cicatrix Maledictum. He showed them a Tyrannid splinter fleet's projected trajectory that would reach an inhabited system within 8 months if interdiction forces weren't repositioned within 6 weeks. Then he sat back and said nothing. The silence lasted 4 minutes. It was, by any measure, a productive 4 minutes. "The operational requirements you're describing," said Inquisitor Lord Carides, a woman whose file contained more redacted sections than legible ones, would require executive authority to coordinate across multiple segmentums simultaneously. "Yes," Guilliman said, "authority that the current High Lord's council structure cannot efficiently provide." "No," he agreed, "it cannot." Another silence. "The theological questions," Carides said carefully, "remain unresolved." "They do," Guilliman said. "I expect they will remain unresolved for some time. I am asking you to consider whether the resolution of those questions should take precedence over the survival of the species they concern." It was not a perfect argument. It was not intended to be. It was intended to give pragmatically minded inquisitors and the Inquisition, whatever its theological fervency, was an organization built on pragmatism, a framework within which supporting the Emperor Regent could be reconciled with their existing oaths and self-image. Several of them used it, not all, but several. What Guilliman had not anticipated, could not have anticipated, because it came from a direction his strategic models had underweighted, was the response from the Ordo Xenos. Specifically, from a single inquisitor named Corvin Dresch, a specialist in Eldar contact and communication, who requested an urgent private meeting on the 11th day and arrived looking like a man who had received news that had rearranged his understanding of reality. He placed on Guilliman's desk a single data slate containing a translated communication from an Eldar farseer of craft world Ulthway, received through channels so indirect they barely constituted channels at all. Guilliman read it twice. The Eldar, characteristically, had not expressed an opinion about his proclamation. They had simply noted, with the serene detachment of a species that experienced time differently from humans, that the threads of fate surrounding Terra had shifted in ways that their seers had not predicted, and that this was unusual enough to warrant observation. They had also noted, almost as an aside, that certain other observers, ones who existed in the spaces between reality and whose interest in imperial instability was well documented, had noticed the same shift and were reacting with what the farseer delicately described as enthusiasm. The ruinous powers were not merely watching, they were preparing. Guilliman set down the data slate and looked at the map of the Imperium with its red and gold and gray, its fracture lines and contested loyalties, and 1,000 ongoing crises that had not paused for his political revolution. He had known this would be difficult. He had known it would fracture the Imperium along every existing fault line. He had calculated the costs and concluded they were worth paying. What he was beginning to understand, with the cold clarity that had made him the greatest strategic mind of his age, was that he had calculated the costs of the schism itself with reasonable accuracy, and had perhaps underestimated the costs of what that schism would invite from the outside. The ruinous powers did not need to defeat the Imperium. They simply needed it to defeat itself. He pulled up the chaos activity reports again and began drafting new orders. In the immaterium, where reality was a suggestion and thought was substance, the news arrived not as information but as sensation. A tremor in the psychic fabric of 10,000 worlds simultaneously reconsidering their relationship with authority. The Chaos Gods experienced it the way a predator experiences the sound of an injured animal, not as an event to be analyzed, but as a stimulus to be acted upon, filtered through 10 millennia of accumulated appetite and the particular flavor of human spiritual crisis. Tzeentch laughed first, because Tzeentch always laughed first, and because this was precisely the kind of cascading, self-replicating ideological fracture that the Changer of Ways considered aesthetically perfect. A million threads of fate simultaneously reweaving themselves, every human who had ever built their identity around imperial faith, now forced to reconstruct that identity from first principles. The psychic resonance of that collective crisis was, to the god of change, something approaching music. His demons flooded the warp-adjacent spaces near Terra with renewed energy, pressing against the thinning membrane between realities with the gleeful persistence of children pushing on a door they know is no longer properly latched. Nurgle, characteristically, was patient. Despair was his medium, and despair required time. The schism had planted seeds, doubt in the faithful, grief in the newly uncertain, the particular festering resentment of those who felt betrayed by an institution they had sacrificed everything for. Those seeds would grow. A Nurgle could wait. He had always been very good at waiting. Khorne was straightforwardly delighted. Regardless of who won the coming conflict, blood would be shed in quantities that the blood god found professionally satisfying. Imperial fighting. Imperial was, from Khorne's perspective, an efficiency improvement. Only Slaanesh was uncertain, tasting the psychic signature of Guilliman's proclamation with the complex sensitivity of a god whose entire existence was oriented toward sensation, and finding it unexpectedly difficult to categorize. There was ambition in it, yes, and the particular intoxicating flavor of a being acting at the absolute limit of their authority. But there was also something else, something disciplined and self-denying, and oriented entirely outward toward species survival that Slaanesh found, in a word, boring. The Dark Prince sulked in his palace of sensation and sent his servants elsewhere. But it was not the Chaos Gods themselves who acted first. It was their mortal instruments, and specifically one mortal instrument who had been watching Guilliman's career with the focused attention of a craftsman studying a rival's technique. Abaddon the Despoiler had launched 13 Black Crusades. He had destroyed Cadia. He had torn the galaxy in half with the Cicatrix Maledictum. He was, by any military assessment, the single most consequential enemy commander the Imperium had faced since Horus himself. And unlike Horus, He had not had the inconvenience of dying at the critical moment. He was patient where Horus had been passionate, systematic where Horus had been inspired, and he had spent 10,000 years developing an understanding of the Imperium's structural vulnerabilities that was, in its own way, as comprehensive as Guilliman's understanding of its military doctrine. He recognized what Guilliman was doing. More importantly, he recognized why it might work. That recognition produced in Abaddon something rare enough to be worth noting: genuine concern, not fear. Abaddon had burned fear out of himself millennia ago, along with several other emotions that he had judged tactically inconvenient. But concern, the cold analytical awareness that an opponent had made a move that altered the fundamental nature of the game. The Imperium that Abaddon had spent 10,000 years learning to destroy was an Imperium paralyzed by institutional dysfunction, governed by a council of competing interests that could never achieve coherent strategic response, sustained by faith in an absent God that could be undermined through the right application of theological pressure. That Imperium he knew how to fight. He had been fighting it for millennia, and he had been winning, slowly, the way a glacier wins, through irresistible accumulated pressure rather than dramatic conquest. Guilliman's Imperium, a functioning executive authority backed by legitimate bloodline succession, capable of coherent strategic coordination across multiple segmentums, reformed enough to address the institutional failures that chaos had always exploited, was a different proposition entirely. He convened his war council aboard the Vengeful Spirit, that ancient and hate-soaked vessel that had carried Horus to his apotheosis and his failure. The demon Primarchs were not present in body. Their physical manifestation were occupied elsewhere, their attention distributed across the 10,000 fronts of an eternal war. But their will was felt in the atmosphere of the council chamber, a psychic pressure that made the air taste of copper and old fire. "He'll fail," said Harken Worldclaimer, Abaddon's herald, with the breezy confidence of a man who had never bothered to be wrong about anything he'd said aloud. "The Ecclesiarchy alone will tear him apart. Give it 6 months." "The Ecclesiarchy," Abaddon said, with the measured patience of a commander who had learned to treat optimism as a tactical liability, "has been trying to tear Guilliman apart since his resurrection. He is still standing." He studied the hololithic display of the Imperial Schism spread before them, a display compiled from thousands of intelligence sources, demon whispers, and mortal agents, and the particular insight that 10,000 years of enemy study produced. He planned this. The proclamation did not emerge from frustration. It emerged from preparation. Every element of his Indomitus crusade, the Primaris distribution, the command appointments, the administrative reforms, they were groundwork. Silence in the council chamber. Outside, the warp churned with the ambient energy of the Chaos God's collective interest. "Then we accelerate," said a voice that came from everywhere and nowhere. Zaraphiston, Abaddon's chief sorcerer, his physical form currently occupying a space that intersected only partially with visible reality. "The schism is an opportunity regardless of its outcome. Imperial fighting. Imperial feeds the dark gods. We press every front simultaneously. We ensure Guilliman's new Imperium is born in crisis so severe that its first acts must be desperate rather than visionary." "Agreed," Abaddon said, "but not blindly. Guilliman will expect military pressure. It's what he's designed to manage. What he cannot easily manage is the simultaneous combination of military pressure and internal theological crisis." He turned to face his council directly. "We do not attack his armies first. We attack his legitimacy." The plan that emerged over the following hours was, by the standards of chaos, remarkably coherent. A testament to Abaddon's discipline and to the genuine threat he perceived in Guilliman's gambit. Chaos warbands across the segmentum solar would increase pressure on multiple fronts simultaneously, not with the goal of territorial conquest, but with the specific objective of forcing Guilliman to commit his reformed executive authority to emergency military response before it had time to consolidate. Every world that burned, every crisis that demanded immediate attention, was a crisis that prevented him from building the institutional foundations his new governance required. Simultaneously, agents already embedded in the Ecclesiarchy, cultists so deeply hidden that some of them had forgotten they were cultists, their original indoctrination buried beneath decades of genuine faith that had been slowly, carefully redirected, would begin amplifying the theological opposition, not directing it, amplifying it. The Ecclesiarchy's resistance was genuine and needed no fabrication. It simply needed encouragement, and Chaos had 10,000 years of experience in providing exactly that kind of encouragement to human institutions already inclined toward self-destruction. It was a sophisticated plan. It was probably, Abaddon acknowledged privately, the most sophisticated plan he had ever constructed. Not because of its military complexity, but because of its political precision. He was not trying to conquer the Imperium. He was trying to ensure that Guilliman's attempt to save it failed in a way that left the Imperium more damaged than before. He was not, however, operating with complete information. The Eldar message that had reached Guilliman's desk had also, by pathways even more indirect, reached Abaddon's awareness, not its content, but the fact of its sending. The Eldar were paying attention. That alone was significant. Craftworld Ulthwé did not invest Farseer attention in scenarios with obvious outcomes. And there was one other variable that Abaddon's otherwise comprehensive intelligence picture had failed to adequately account for. He had modeled Guilliman's military response. He had modeled the Ecclesiarchy's theological resistance. He had modeled the High Lord's political maneuvering and the Astra Militarum's fractured loyalty and the Space Marine chapter's divided allegiances. He had not adequately modeled what would happen when the Primaris Space Marines, those new warriors created from Guilliman's own genetic template, distributed across hundreds of chapters, he built from the beginning to embody his vision of what the Astartes should be, began to fully understand what was at stake. The first indication came as a Vox intercept from a Primaris captain of the Ultramarines' second company, transmitted to his chapter master and subsequently forwarded through channels that Chaos Intelligence had compromised. It was a short message, characteristically direct. The Emperor Regent has made his move. It is our turn, awaiting orders. Abaddon read the intercept. He was quiet for a long moment. "Accelerate the timeline," he said. "All fronts. Now." The Codex Astartes had governed Space Marine doctrine for 10,000 years. It was, depending on who you asked, either the most important military document in human history or the most catastrophic act of institutional conservatism ever committed to parchment. Guilliman himself had spent considerable private time in the years since his resurrection, reconsidering certain of its more rigid prescriptions, an experience he described to no one, but which his staff had learned to recognize by the particular quality of his silence when the Codex was cited against him in strategic councils. The document had never addressed the question of what a Space Marine chapter should do when its creator declared himself Emperor Regent. This was, in retrospect, an oversight. The responses came in over the course of 3 weeks, arriving at the Imperial Palace through every available channel, formal vox communiques sealed with chapter heraldry, terse battlefield transmissions from chapters too deep in active combat to compose anything more elaborate, and in 3 cases, personal messages addressed directly to Guilliman that bypassed official channels entirely and arrived through means that his security staff found professionally concerning. He read all of them personally. He had insisted on that, over the objections of aides who pointed out that reading several hundred chapter responses was not an efficient use of a Supreme Commander's time. He had explained, with the patience of a man who had written the manual on chain of command, that these were his sons. Efficiency was not the relevant metric. The responses sorted themselves broadly into 4 categories, and the distribution between those categories told Guilliman more about the state of the Astartes than any intelligence report could have managed. The first category was support, immediate, unqualified, and in some cases embarrassingly enthusiastic. The Ultramarines, unsurprisingly, led this group. Their chapter master's response, a model of formal declaration that nonetheless managed to convey the particular pride of an institution watching its founding principles vindicated. The Primaris-heavy chapters followed almost unanimously, their shorter institutional histories making them less invested in the pre-Guilliman status quo and their genetic connection to the Emperor Regent, a factor that no amount of codex interpretation could entirely neutralize. Several older chapters with long histories of cooperation with Guilliman's campaigns added their voices, the Iron Hands, whose pragmatism ran deeper than their theology, the Raven Guard, whose chapter master sent a single line that read, "About time," and nothing else. The second category was opposition, ranging from the formal to the incandescent. The Black Templars were first and loudest, their response arriving within hours of the proclamation in the form of a document so theologically dense and rhetorically furious that 2 of Guilliman's staff members who attempted to summarize it gave up and simply forwarded it whole. The Black Templars had always been the Ecclesiarchy's closest Astartes allies, their crusading faith oriented with particular intensity toward the Emperor's divinity, and Guilliman's claim struck them not as political innovation, but as personal affront. The Soul Drinkers had already declared their position. Several other chapters with strong ecclesiarchal ties followed within the week, their responses varying in tone from regretful to openly hostile. The third category was silence, deliberate, meaningful silence from chapters whose chapter masters had read the proclamation, assessed the situation, and concluded that the wisest response was to continue fighting whatever was in front of them, while the theological and political questions sorted themselves out. This was, Guilliman recognized, both the most militarily sensible response and the most politically complex. Silent chapters were uncommitted. Chapters, and uncommitted chapters, were a variable that both sides would spend considerable energy attempting to resolve. The fourth category was the one that kept him awake. It was a small category, 7 chapters. Their responses shared a common thread that was not quite support for Guilliman and not quite opposition to him, but something more troubling than either. They were questioning the legitimacy of the entire framework, not just his claim. The emperors, the Imperiums, the 10,000-year project of human civilization organized around a single divine figure on a single throne. The most articulate of these responses came from a chapter called the Void Inheritors, a fleet-based chapter of uncertain founding, whose records in the administratum were, charitably, incomplete. Their chapter master, a veteran whose name Guilliman's intelligence files rendered as Theocarus, but who apparently went by something else among his brothers, had written a response of considerable philosophical sophistication that deserved, under other circumstances, a thoughtful and extended reply. Its central argument was this: Guilliman's proclamation, whatever its intent, was built on the same foundational error as the system it sought to replace. It assumed that the Imperium's problems were problems of management, that the right executive authority, efficiently applied, could correct the institutional failures of 10 millennia. But the problems were not managerial. They were structural. They were the inevitable product of a civilization built entirely around a single point of failure, a civilization so thoroughly organized around one being's continued existence that it had never developed the capacity to function without him. Replacing the Emperor's absence with Guilliman's presence did not solve that structural problem. It deferred it. What the Void Inheritors proposed instead was not articulated clearly, which Guilliman suspected was intentional. But the implication threaded through the response like a blade through silk. Perhaps the Imperium needed to be rebuilt from foundations that did not require a god. He read this response 4 times. Then he set it aside in a separate file that he labeled, with characteristic directness, "Problems for later," and returned to the immediate crisis. The immediate crisis was the Black Templars. High Marshal Helbrecht had not been content with a strongly worded communiqué. He had recalled crusading fleets from 3 separate active war zones, a military decision of extraordinary boldness that had already cost the Imperium 2 contested systems, and be moving with the focused, terrible purpose of a man who had decided that this particular question needed to be answered with the kind of clarity that only direct confrontation provided. He was, Guilliman's intelligence suggested, heading for Terra. The prospect of the Black Templars arriving in the Sol system with hostile intent presented a tactical problem of significant complexity. They were not traitors. They were not chaos-aligned. They were space marines of unquestionable loyalty to the Emperor. It was precisely their loyalty to the Emperor that was driving them toward what would functionally be civil war. As shooting them down was militarily straightforward and politically catastrophic. Not shooting them down was militarily complicated and politically only slightly less catastrophic. He needed a third option. It came from an unexpected source. Brother Captain Marius Acastus of the Grey Knights, that most secret of Space Marine chapters, the ones who fought demons so that no one else had to know demons could be fought, requested an audience through channels so thoroughly unofficial that Guilliman's security staff nearly missed the request entirely. The Grey Knights did not, as a matter of institutional policy, involve themselves in political affairs. Their mandate was singular: protect humanity from the demonic. Everything else was noise. Acastus arrived at the audience without ceremony, without honor guard, without the elaborate formal apparatus that most chapter representatives considered appropriate. He was a compact man for an Astartes, his armor bearing the marks of engagements that the official record did not acknowledge, his eyes carrying the particular quality of someone who had seen things that had permanently recalibrated their sense of what mattered. "The chaos activity increase," he said, without preamble, "is not opportunistic. It is coordinated. We have identified 17 separate incursion attempts in the past 8 days, each one probing a different point along the cicatrix maledictum. The pattern is consistent with a directed strategy rather than opportunistic exploitation." "Abaddon," Guilliman said. "Almost certainly. But the specific targeting suggests intelligence about our defensive dispositions that implies either significant infiltration of Imperial command structures or demonic foresight at a level we haven't encountered since the Siege of Terra." Acastus paused. "Possibly both." Guilliman looked at him steadily. "You didn't come here to brief me on chaos activity. My intelligence staff does that." "No," Acastus agreed. "I came to tell you that the Grey Knights will support the Emperor Regent's authority." A pause. "Conditionally." "The condition?" "When the Black Templars arrive, and they will arrive, you do not meet them with force. You meet them with Helbrecht personally. One Primarch, one High Marshal, no armies between them." Acastus held his gaze. "Whatever your disagreements with his theology, Helbrecht is not an enemy. He is a man who loves the Emperor with everything he is, and he needs to see that you do too. Not in a proclamation, in person." Guilliman was quiet for a moment. Outside the Strategium's viewports, Terra turned in its ancient orbit, carrying its billions of uncertain, frightened, faithful inhabitants. "You're asking me to make myself vulnerable," he said. "I'm asking you to remember," Acastus said carefully, "that the Imperium you're trying to save is made of people, not positions. Helbrecht doesn't need to be defeated. He needs to be heard." He stood. "The Grey Knights will handle the chaos incursions at points 7 through 12 along the cicatrix. That buys you time. Use it well." He left without waiting for a response, which Guilliman found simultaneously irritating and impressive. He pulled up Helbrecht's fleet trajectory on the hololithic display, calculated the intercept window, and began composing a personal vox message to the High Marshal of the Black Templars. Not an order, not a proclamation, but something he had written very few of in his long life. An invitation. The meeting took place in the void, equidistant between Terra and the leading edge of the Black Templars' fleet. A location chosen by Guilliman with the deliberate symbolism of a man who understood that geography was never merely geography. He came alone, or as alone as a Primarch could reasonably manage, aboard a single shark assault boat crewed by 4 Ultramarines who had been selected for their ability to remain absolutely still and say nothing for extended periods. He wore the armor of fate and carried no weapons beyond the Hand of Dominion and the Emperor's sword, which was simultaneously a gesture of respect and a reminder that his definition of unarmed was relative. Helbrecht came in a thunderhawk painted in the stark black and white of his chapter, crewed by a crusade force of 12 Black Templars who looked, to Guilliman's experienced eye, like men who had been talked out of bringing more by a very narrow margin. The High Marshal himself was everything his reputation suggested. A warrior of immense physical presence, even by Astartes standards, his armor bearing the accumulated honor marks of a crusade career that had lasted longer than some planetary governments, his face carrying the particular expression of a man who had decided that this meeting was either going to resolve something or clarify exactly what needed to be destroyed. They met in the conference bay of a neutral vessel, an ancient rogue trader ship whose owner had been persuaded, through a combination of financial incentive and implied consequences, to make herself scarce for the duration. The conference bay was functional rather than ceremonial, which suited both of them. They sat across from each other at a plain Duralloy table. No aides, no honor guards, no Vox recorders, though Guilliman assumed Helbrecht had found some means of recording anyway, because he would have in the same position. Helbrecht spoke first. "You have fractured the Imperium," he said. Not an accusation, precisely. A statement of fact delivered with the flat certainty of a man who had decided that clarity was owed, regardless of consequence. In the middle of the greatest war humanity has ever faced, you have given our enemies a weapon they could not have manufactured themselves. Every world that burns while Imperial fights Imperial, that blood is on your hands, Lord Commander. Emperor Regent, Guilliman said, without heat. No, Helbrecht's voice was absolutely steady. Not to me, not yet, perhaps not ever. He leaned forward slightly. I have spent my life fighting for the Emperor, not for the Imperium's institutions, which I have watched fail consistently for as long as I have served. Not for the High Lords, whom I regard with a contempt I have rarely bothered to conceal. For him, for that light on the throne, for the being who looked at humanity in its darkest moment and said, I will hold the line. I will pay whatever cost is required. I will burn myself down to nothing if that is what it takes. He paused. That is what I serve. That is what I have always served. And you, a breath, controlled, precise. You have told every faithful human being in this Imperium that their relationship with that being requires your mediation. Guilliman listened to this without interrupting, which was not as easy as it appeared. I understand what you serve, he said, when Helbrecht finished. I know because I watched him. I knew him before the throne, before the faith, before 10,000 years of accumulated theology made him into something that even I struggle to recognize as my father. He held the High Marshal's gaze. He was a man of extraordinary capability and extraordinary cost. He built the Imperium because humanity needed it. He sacrificed himself because humanity needed that too. I do not dispute his divinity. I am genuinely uncertain about its nature, and I think that uncertainty is more honest than false confidence in either direction. A pause. What I dispute is the claim that his will is best served by an institution that has spent 10 millennia using his name to protect its own power. And yours is better, Helbrecht said. One man's judgment, however gifted, is a different problem from 10,000 years of institutional failure, not a solution to it. Yes, Guilliman said simply. That's true. The admission landed in the silence between them like something unexpected. Helbrecht's expression shifted fractionally, not softening, but recalibrating. Then why? The High Marshal asked, and for the first time there was something beneath the certainty, something that sounded almost like the question a man asks when he genuinely wants the answer rather than the confirmation. Guilliman was quiet for a moment. Outside the viewport of the conference bay, stars burned with the indifferent permanence of things that had existed before humanity and would exist long after. And the galaxy turned on its slow axis, carrying its trillion inhabitants through another increment of a darkness that showed no sign of ending. Because the alternative, he said, is watching it fall. Not quickly, not in a single catastrophic defeat that history could at least point to and name. Slowly. The way a great building falls when no one maintains it, when every bureaucrat responsible for its upkeep finds it more convenient to file a report than fix a crack, when the cracks become fissures and the fissures become collapse, and by the time anyone admits what's happening, there is nothing left to save. He looked at Helbrecht directly. I have read the reports, High Marshal, all of them. The ones that don't reach the High Lords because someone has decided they're too destabilizing. The ones that describe not dramatic defeats, but quiet disappearances. Worlds that stopped responding to administrative demands, systems that fell silent, populations that stopped existing without anyone being entirely sure when or why. A pause. The Imperium is not losing the war at its edges. It is dissolving at its center. And the faith, the beautiful, a necessary faith that has kept humanity alive through horrors that should have ended us, has been weaponized by people who understand that a population focused entirely on divine salvation is a population that will not demand institutional accountability. Helbrecht said nothing. He was thinking, and the quality of his silence had changed. I am not asking you to stop believing, Guilliman said. I am not asking you to set aside your oaths or diminish your faith or accept that the Emperor is anything less than what you know him to be. I am asking you to consider that he might be better served by an Imperium that functions than by one that burns his name while burning itself. He leaned forward. I am also asking you to consider what Abaddon is doing while we sit here. He placed a data slate on the table between them. 17 coordinated chaos incursion attempts, the pattern analysis from the Grey Knights, projected casualty figures if the incursion succeeded while Imperial forces were divided. Helbrecht looked at the data slate for a long time. I will not call you Emperor Regent, he said finally. I'm not asking you to. I will not publicly endorse your claim. I'm not asking you to do that either. A silence that had changed its quality again, moving from confrontation through something more complicated towards something that was not quite resolution, but was at least the shape of possibility. What are you asking? Helbrecht said. Turn your fleet around, Guilliman said. Take your crusade to the 7th point along the Cicatrix Maledictum, where the Grey Knights have identified a chaos incursion that will breach into real space within 3 weeks without interdiction. Fight what needs to be fought. Keep your theological objections. They are legitimate, and I expect they will be resolved not by argument, but by results over time. He held the High Marshal's gaze. And trust that a man who loves the Emperor enough to risk everything on his behalf is not, whatever his methods, his enemy. The silence that followed was the longest of the meeting. 3 conditions, Helbrecht said. Name them. First, you establish a formal council of theological review, not ecclesiarchal. I know you won't accept that, but independent scholars and senior chaplains from multiple chapters to examine the doctrinal implications of your claim, not to override your authority, to provide structured theological engagement rather than opposition in a vacuum. Guilliman nodded. Acceptable. Second, you never, under any circumstances, regardless of military necessity, issue orders to Space Marine chapters as Emperor. You issue them as Primarch and Lord Commander. The distinction matters. Another nod. Also acceptable. I had not planned otherwise. Helbrecht paused on the 3rd condition for a moment that suggested it was the one he had argued hardest with himself about. Third, if the Emperor, if he shows any sign, any indication through the mechanisms of the throne, or through his light, or through whatever means remain available to him, if he indicates opposition to your claim, you step down, immediately and without contest. The conference bay was very quiet. Guilliman thought of the Golden Throne's warmth beneath his gauntlet, of the silence that had answered his question, of the Farsayer's note about shifting fate threads that the Eldar's seers had not predicted. Yes, he said, that condition I accept without reservation. Something moved across Helbrecht's expression that might, in a less rigorously composed man, have been called relief. The High Marshal of the Black Templars stood, and after a moment extended his hand, not in the formal grip of Astartes' brotherhood, but in the older, simpler gesture of one warrior to another across a table where something difficult had just been attempted. Guilliman took it. Neither of them spoke again. There was nothing left that needed saying, and both of them were men who understood the value of not filling silence with words it didn't require. The Black Templars turned their fleet around 17 hours later. By the time they reached the 7th point on the Cicatrix Maledictum, the Chaos incursion had escalated beyond the Grey Knight's containment capacity, and High Marshal Helbrecht's Crusaders hit it with the full, devastating force of warriors who had been looking for something worthy to fight and had finally found it. 3 weeks later, the incursion was destroyed. Casualties were significant. The victory was absolute. Guilliman received the after-action report in his strategium and permitted himself, briefly, something that was not quite satisfaction, but occupied a similar space. Then he turned to the next report, because there was always a next report, and the galaxy did not pause for small victories. The next report was from Craftworld Ulthway. It was longer than the last one, and it contained, near the end, a single line that made the relief of the Helbrecht meeting evaporate entirely. The one you have not yet considered is moving. He has been watching since the beginning, and he is not moving toward you. Guilliman stared at that line for a long moment. He is moving toward the throne. The name in the Ulthway message was not written. Eldar Farseers did not commit certain names to any medium that could be intercepted, a precaution born from 10,000 years of experience with enemies who could read intention from psychic resonance, and who treated information about their own movements as a weapon to be controlled. but Guilliman did not need the name written. There were very few beings in the galaxy whose movement toward the Golden Throne would constitute a threat requiring Eldar attention, and fewer still whose approach would be characterized by the particular quality of patient, deliberate positioning that the message implied. He summoned Inquisitor Lord Carides within the hour. She arrived looking like she hadn't slept, which was accurate, and like she had been expecting exactly this summons, which was also accurate. "Magnus," Guilliman said. Carides sat down without being invited. "We've had intermittent intelligence suggesting elevated activity from the planet of sorcerers for the past 3 weeks. Nothing definitive. Magnus is careful in ways that Mortarion, for instance, is not, but the pattern is consistent with preparation rather than opportunistic operation." She placed her own data slate on the desk. "The specific concern is the webway. The Emperor's webway project, the one that never reached completion because of what Magnus did to it during the heresy. There are indications that certain sections of the network beneath the Imperial Palace have become, over the past month, more active." Guilliman looked at the data slate. The technical readings were from Mechanicus sensors embedded in the sub-levels of the palace, ancient instruments installed as part of security measures whose original architects were 10 millennia dead. The readings were subtle. They were also, to anyone who understood what the Webway project had been attempting, unmistakable. "He's using the tunnels he broke," Guilliman said. "Using is perhaps generous. Probing, testing. The damage he caused during the heresy was catastrophic, but not total. There are sections of the webway beneath Terra that remain partially intact, sealed, but not destroyed. If he has found a way to navigate those sections, he could reach the throne room without passing through a single Imperial defensive line," Guilliman finished. The silence between them had the quality of a calculation being performed. A Magnus the Red, Primarch of the Thousand Suns, architect of the greatest single act of well-intentioned catastrophe in human history. The psychic assault on the wards of the primordial annihilator that had shattered the Emperor's Webway project, killed a significant portion of the custodes, and forced the Emperor onto the Golden Throne decades before his plan had been ready. Magnus had done it trying to warn his father of Horus's treachery. He had destroyed everything trying to help. The tragedy of it was the kind that didn't get smaller with distance, the kind that the warp had preserved perfectly for 10,000 years in all its original, excruciating complexity. What Magnus wanted now was the question that no intelligence report had satisfactorily answered. His chaos allegiance was nominal at best. He served Tzeentch not from devotion, but from the transactional pragmatism of a being who needed the warp's power to sustain his physical form and had limited options for its source. His relationship with the Imperium was the most complicated relationship in the galaxy, a fact that the Imperium acknowledged by trying very hard not to think about it. And his relationship with the Golden Throne, with the being on it, with the 10,000-year consequence of one desperate, disastrous decision, that was something that defied simple categorization. Guilliman thought about what Magnus might want from the throne, and found that he could construct at least 4 entirely plausible motivations, it ranging from redemption to sabotage, to something so far outside imperial conceptual frameworks that naming it was difficult. He found that he could not determine which was most likely with any confidence he was willing to act on. He needed to know which. The decision about how to respond, whether to reinforce the sublevels, seal the webway tunnels with the kind of drastic measures that would collapse significant portions of the palace infrastructure, or attempt something considerably more dangerous, depended entirely on understanding what Magnus intended. There was one being in the Imperium who might know, who had interacted with Magnus more recently than anyone else, who had her own complicated relationship with the Primarch of the Thousand Suns, who had spent enough time navigating the intersection of Eldar and human fate threads to have developed instincts about the motivations of beings who operated outside conventional alignment. Guilliman sent a personal message to Yvraine, emissary of Iniad, and asked for an immediate audience. Her response came in 4 hours, which for an Eldar response to Imperial communication was essentially instantaneous and implied either urgency or the particular Eldar quality of having already anticipated the request and prepared accordingly. Possibly both. She arrived at the palace with Vizark at her shoulder and the quiet, composed certainty of a woman who had died and been reborn by a god of the dead, and had consequently developed a perspective on existential crisis that made imperial political upheaval seem manageable by comparison. She had supported Guilliman's resurrection. She had fought alongside him. She regarded the proclamation, she said, without preamble, as inevitable and probably necessary, though she noted that Eldar definitions of necessary were weighted differently than human ones. Magnus, Guilliman said, dispensing with protocol. Yes, she said. He reached out to us 3 weeks ago, indirectly through channels that maintained deniability on both sides. She held Guilliman's gaze steadily. He wants to repair it. Guilliman was very still. The webway, the wards, the damage he caused. She paused. He has spent 10,000 years learning things that no other being in this galaxy knows about the intersection of psychic architecture and physical reality. The Thousand Suns' sorceress knowledge, combined with what Tzeentch's labyrinth has shown him, he believes he has developed a means of addressing the fundamental damage, not restoring the Webway project to its original vision, but sealing the breach, stabilizing the throne's connection to the geomantic network, potentially, another pause, waited, reducing the number of psychers required to sustain it. The implication settled into the room like something physical, the imperial tithe of psychers. 1,000 souls a day, consumed by the Golden Throne to keep the Astronomicon burning and the Emperor alive. 1,000 human beings every day for 10,000 years. The mathematics of it were staggering and had always been staggering in an atrocity so enormous and so necessary that the Imperium had long since developed the psychological infrastructure to not think about it directly. If the number could be reduced, if the efficiency of the throne's operation could be improved significantly enough. Why? Guilliman said, not skeptically. As a genuine question that required a genuine answer before any other consideration was relevant. Yvraine was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice had the quality of someone conveying something they had been asked to convey precisely, without interpretation. He said, "Because I have been paying for it for 10,000 years, and I would like, before the end of everything, to pay something toward the debt rather than simply carrying it. Guilliman stood and moved to the viewport. Terra below, ancient and vast, and carrying its billions of faithful and frightened inhabitants through another day of a war that had no visible end. He would have to come here, Guilliman said, to the palace, to the throne room. Yes, the custodes will not permit it. No, Yvraine agreed, they will not. The Ecclesiarchy, if they learned of it, would use it to destroy every argument I have made about the legitimacy of this transition. Almost certainly. And if his assessment is wrong, if the damage cannot be repaired, or if the attempt destabilizes the throne's existing mechanisms, then the Emperor dies, Yvraine said simply, and the Astronomicon goes dark, and the Imperium ends within a generation. She did not look away. He is aware of this. He wanted me to be explicit with you about it because he said, a brief pause. He said you deserved the honest version of the risk rather than a version optimized to make you agree. Guilliman turned from the viewport. In his long life, across wars and campaigns and administrative challenges of extraordinary complexity, he had made decisions that cost millions of lives on calculations of military necessity. He had signed orders for planetary bombardment and strategic withdrawal, and 100 other choices that lived permanently in the part of him that kept accounts. He had never made a decision that carried this particular weight. A decision whose downside was not catastrophic loss, but total annihilation, whose upside was a structural improvement so significant it would change the nature of what the Imperium was, and whose hinge point was the trustworthiness of a chaos-aligned Primarch who had spent 10,000 years being wrong in ways that had destroyed everything he loved. He thought about what Helbrecht had said. If he shows any sign, he thought about the warmth beneath his gauntlet at the base of the throne. He thought about 1,000 psychers a day, every day, for 10,000 years. I need to speak with the Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes, he said. He will refuse, Yvraine said. I know. Guilliman was already moving toward the door. I need to speak with him anyway. Bring him here or bring me there. I don't care which. And tell Magnus. He paused at the threshold, something crossing his expression that was not quite any single emotion, but occupied the space where several of them intersected. Tell him I am listening. That is not agreement, but it is not refusal. Yvraine inclined her head with the precise degree of acknowledgement that the Eldar reserved for moments they considered significant. After she left, Guilliman stood alone in his strategium for exactly 4 minutes. His staff had learned to track these silences, understanding they represented not absence of thought, but its most intense presence, and then sat down and began writing the most difficult document of his administrative career. It was not an order. It was not a proclamation. It was a letter to his father, handwritten on physical parchment, in the formal script of Macragge that the Emperor had once taught him personally during better centuries. It explained what Magnus had proposed. It explained the risks. It explained why Guilliman was considering it despite those risks. And it asked, with the directness of a son who had stopped expecting answers, but had not stopped believing in the value of the question, what would you have me do? He sealed the letter and had it delivered to the Sanctum Imperialis, to the base of the golden throne, where a custodian placed it with the careful reverence of a soldier who had learned that the emperor's silence did not mean the emperor was absent. Then he went to meet the captain general, and the hardest argument of his political career began. The captain general of the Adeptus Custodes was a being of such concentrated, a singular purpose that conversations with him tended to feel less like dialogue and more like impact. Trajan Valoris had served the emperor since before the heresy in the reckoning of his own memory, though the warp's distortions made precise timekeeping difficult for anyone who had spent significant periods near the Golden Throne. He was not a political creature. He was not an institutional creature. He was, with a purity of focus that most humans could not sustain, and most Astartes could only approximate, a guardian. The guardian, the living expression of an oath sworn to a specific being, rather than to an empire, or a theology, or a chain of command. He had not publicly commented on Guilliman's proclamation. The Adeptus Custodes did not do politics. They did proximity to the emperor, and everything else was evaluated through that single lens. He received Guilliman in the Eternity Gate's antechamber, standing rather than sitting in armor that made the Emperor Regent's own formidable plate look almost modest by comparison. Around them, the great golden doors that separated the palace's inner sanctum from the broader complex rose 40 meters into vaulted ceilings, carved with scenes from the Great Crusade, a history that both of them had lived rather than studied, which gave the carvings a quality that art historians would have found interesting, and that both men found quietly painful. Guilliman presented the case without preamble or diplomatic softening, because Valoris was not a man who rewarded either. He laid out Magnus's proposal, Ivrain's assessment, the intelligence about the webway activity beneath the palace, the potential reduction in the Psyker tithe, and the catastrophic downside risk in full, unvarnished sequence. Valoris listened without expression throughout. When Guilliman finished, the Captain General was quiet for a long moment. "No," he said. Guilliman had expected this. "I need you to explain the no," he said. "Not because I intend to override it. The Custode's authority over access to the throne room is not subject to imperial executive authority, and I have no intention of pretending otherwise. But I need to understand which version of no this is." Valoris looked at him with the measuring quality of a man calibrating exactly how much explanation was warranted. "There are two versions," the Captain General said. "The first is tactical. Magnus the Red entering the palace. Sub-levels through damaged webway tunnels represents a security risk that cannot be adequately mitigated regardless of his stated intentions. His psychic capability within proximity of the throne's geomantic network is an existential threat to the throne's stability that exists independent of whether he is attempting repair or sabotage. The act of what he proposes and the act of destroying the throne from the inside are, from a security standpoint, indistinguishable until the outcome is determined, and at that point, response is irrelevant." "And the second version?" Guilliman asked. Another silence, longer than the first. "The Emperor," Valoris said, with a careful precision that suggested each word was being chosen from a larger set, and the unchosen words were not being discarded lightly, "has not been entirely silent since your proclamation." Guilliman was very still. Not in any form that constitutes communication by any conventional definition, Valoris continued. Not words, not images, not directed psychic impulse in any form we can interpret with confidence. He paused. But the throne's output has changed. The geomantic readings that our most senior priests of Mars monitor continuously have shifted in pattern. The psychers who serve on the throne, those brief, terrible terms of service before the next one is brought, have reported in their final moments before the end something different from the baseline. Not pain, which is constant and unremarkable. Something they describe with the limited vocabulary available to beings in their condition as, he paused again, attention. The antechamber of the Eternity Gate was very quiet. Distantly, the hum of the throne's machinery was a constant beneath everything, the mechanical heartbeat of a civilization. "He's aware," Guilliman said. "We believe so. We have believed so, with increasing confidence since your proclamation." Valoris held his gaze. "Which means the second version of my refusal is this. Whatever Magnus proposes to do, whatever its outcome, that decision should not be made by you, or by me, or by an Eldar emissary, or by a Chaos Primarch who has his own 10,000 years of motivation that none of us can fully parse." A pause. "It should wait." "For what?" Guilliman asked, though he suspected he already knew. "The throne's readings have not merely shifted in pattern," Valoris said. "They have been escalating, incrementally, over the past 3 weeks at a rate of change that our analysts describe as unprecedented in the full recorded history of the throne's operation." He looked at Guilliman with the expression of a man delivering information that had rearranged his own understanding of reality and had not yet finished doing so. "Something is building. We do not know what. We do not know when. But the Emperor is not simply aware, Lord Regent. He is—" The Captain General paused for a long time on the final word, as though testing its weight, preparing. In the silence that followed, Guilliman thought of his letter, delivered to the base of the throne on physical parchment in the formal script of Macraga. He thought about warmth. He thought about 10,000 years of silence that might not have been absence. "How long?" he said. "Our analysts won't commit to a timeline," Valoris said. "Days, weeks, possibly longer. The rate of escalation has not been linear. It accelerates in response to external events in ways that suggest active monitoring rather than passive process." Another pause. "Your proclamation accelerated it significantly. The Helbrecht meeting accelerated it further. The intelligence about Magnus's proposal," he glanced at the sealed inner doors, "that reached the throne's awareness through mechanisms we don't fully understand approximately 6 hours before you walked through that door. The readings spiked." Guilliman absorbed this with the focused stillness of a man to whom the information was both everything he had hoped for and more complicated than he had prepared for. "He needs more time," he said. We believe so. Which means I need to hold the Imperium together long enough for whatever is building to complete." He was already thinking operationally, the political and theological questions reformatting themselves in his mind as tactical variables. The chaos pressure along the cicatrix, the Ecclesiarchy's opposition, the fractured chapters, the Astra Militarum split. He looked at Valoris. And Magnus, moving through the webway tunnels toward a throne that is in the middle of a process we don't understand, and cannot risk destabilizing. Yes, Valoris said. All of those things simultaneously. Tell Magnus to stop, Guilliman said. Not permanently. Tell him I will contact him directly when the throne's process is complete, or when it becomes clear it won't complete in time. Tell him. He paused, and something crossed his expression that was difficult to categorize, the look of a man making a promise he hoped he could keep. Tell him his proposal has not been refused. It has been deferred. There is a difference. Valoris inclined his head. It was a small gesture from a being who did not make large ones without reason, and it carried the weight of a man who had spent 10,000 years making judgments about who deserved trust and who had just made one. There is one more thing, the Captain General said, as Guilliman turned to leave. Of course there is, Guilliman said, without bitterness. The letter you sent, the parchment. Valoris paused. We placed it at the base of the throne as you requested. Standard procedure is to collect and archive such items. The throne receives devotional objects regularly, and they are cataloged for historical record. He met Guilliman's eyes. When the custodian went to collect your letter this morning, it was gone. The antechamber of the Eternity Gate was very quiet for a long moment. Gone, Guilliman said. No ash, no residue, no evidence of removal by any physical agency we can identify. Valoris's expression was as close to unreadable as a human face could manage. Gone. Guilliman stood with that information for a moment that stretched longer than its clock time suggested. Then he straightened, and the armor of fate caught the golden light of the antechamber and held it, and he looked, briefly, like something that belonged in those carved scenes on the vaulted walls above them, a figure from a history that was not yet finished being written. Then we hold, he said, whatever it takes, however long it requires. We hold. He left the antechamber and walked back through the corridors of the Imperial Palace into the organized emergency of a galaxy that had not stopped requiring his attention for a single moment since his resurrection, and he issued 17 separate operational orders in the next 4 hours, covering chaos interdiction along the cicatrix maledictum, a formal proposal to the Ecclesiarchy for the Theological Review Council Helbrecht had requested, updated supply line priorities for 3 active war zones, and a carefully worded communication to Magnus the Red that was transmitted through channels so indirect they barely constituted channels at all. And in the Sanctum Imperialis, behind the great golden doors of the Eternity Gate, the custodians who monitored the throne's readings watched the escalating pattern of output continue its unprecedented climb and said nothing to anyone because there was nothing to say that the readings themselves did not already say more clearly. Something was coming. The only question was whether the Imperium would still be standing when it arrived. The escalation took 11 days. 11 days during which Guilliman ran the Imperium with the focused, relentless efficiency of a man who understood that the margin between survival and collapse was measured not in grand gestures, but in 10,000 consecutive correct decisions made under conditions specifically designed to prevent correct decisions from being made. He slept 4 hours a night. He ate at his desk. He conducted 17 strategic councils, signed 432 operational orders, personally resolve 2 command disputes that had escalated to the edge of open violence, and delivered a public address to the assembled population of Terra that was broadcast across every available channel, and that his staff, in private, it described as the most important speech anyone had given since Sebastian Thor's Reformation. Though none of them said this where he could hear it, because he would have found the comparison both flattering and distracting, and he had no time for either. The chaos pressure along the Cicatrix Maledictum intensified on the 3rd day, exactly as Abaddon's plan required, probing 17 separate defensive positions simultaneously with the coordinated precision of a commander who had been planning this specific campaign for longer than most imperial institutions had existed. Guilliman met it with the redistributed forces his executive authority had made available. The coherent strategic response that the old High Lord's Council could never have achieved, in commanders who had been positioned during the Indomitus Crusade, now operating with the unity of purpose that his governance had been designed to produce. The chaos forces did not break. They were not intended to break. They were intended to bleed, and they bled on both sides, and the grinding mathematics of it were brutal and would remain brutal for months to come. But they held. For the first time in the long losing calculation of the Imperium's war against chaos, the defensive lines held with something approaching coherence. On the 5th day, the Ecclesiarchy made its most significant move. Ecclesiarch Salvator, having concluded that theological argument alone was insufficient to reverse Guilliman's consolidation of authority, then issued a call for a grand convocation, a gathering of senior ministorum leadership from across the Imperium to formally adjudicate the question of the Emperor Regent's legitimacy. It was a sophisticated maneuver. The convocation process was ancient, respected, and sufficiently slow-moving that its outcome would arrive long after the immediate crisis had resolved in one direction or another. But its convening positioned the Ecclesiarchy as the legitimate arbitrating body for questions of imperial theology in ways that would have long-term institutional consequences regardless of what the throne did in the next 11 days. Guilliman accepted the convocation proposal immediately and publicly, which was not the response Salvator had anticipated. He appointed 3 senior chaplains from chapters that had declared for his authority, 3 independent theological scholars of genuine distinction, and, in a move that generated more political commentary than anything else he had done since the proclamation, a representative of the Order of Our Martyred Lady, whose studied neutrality suddenly became an asset rather than an ambiguity. The Theological Review Council that Helbrecht had demanded as his condition was folded into the convocation structure, with an efficiency that suggested Guilliman had been thinking about this architecture for longer than the Ecclesiarch had been planning the convocation. Salvator read the counter-proposal and was quiet for a long time. He then sent a private communication to his own senior advisors that was intercepted by 3 separate intelligence services, and that read, in its entirety, "He is better at this than I expected. Adjust accordingly." On the 7th day, the Grey Knights reported that the webway activity beneath the palace sublevels had ceased. Magnus, it seemed, had received Guilliman's message and had stopped. Whether this represented compliance, strategic recalibration, or something else entirely, was a question that the intelligence services debated with the particular anxiety of people who understood that Magnus the Red's motivations were never simple, and that ceased activity was not the same as abandoned intention. On the 9th day, 3 of the 7 questioning chapters, those who had challenged not just Guilliman's claim, but the entire foundational framework of imperial civilization, sent follow-up communications, not declarations of support, not declarations of opposition, something more interesting, requests for dialogue. Formal, careful, structured dialogue through channels that preserved their independence while acknowledging that independence and isolation were not the same thing. The Void Inheritors chapter, Master, whose philosophical response had gone into the problems for later file, requested a personal meeting with the Emperor Regent. Guilliman accepted and scheduled it for 3 weeks hence, which was either optimistic or confident, depending on how the next 2 days went. On the 10th day, Yvraine arrived unannounced at the Imperial Palace in a state that the custodians at the gate described, in their formal incident report, as composed but urgent, which for an Eldar translated roughly to something between alarm and awe. She was admitted immediately and brought to Guilliman's strategium, where she stood for a moment without speaking, which was unusual enough that his entire staff read it as significant. "The Farseer of Ulthwé," she said, "has gone silent." "Meaning?" Guilliman said. "Meaning she was mid-sentence in a communication to our own seers when the connection ceased. Not interrupted, not blocked." Yvraine paused. "She stopped because something happened that required her complete attention. Something she did not predict." A further pause. "In 10,000 years of Farseer practice, Eldrad Ulthrin has been surprised by events a handful of times. Each instance has been historically significant." Guilliman was already standing, already moving toward the door. The throne room's readings spiked on the morning of the 11th day. Every custodian in the Sanctum Imperialis felt it simultaneously, not through any instrument, but directly, in the way that beings who had devoted their entire existence to proximity to a specific divine presence recognized that presence changing. The senior Mechanicus priests monitoring the throne's systems watched their instruments register outputs that exceeded every parameter their equipment had been calibrated to measure, and then watched their equipment fail to measure them, and then stood in the sudden quiet of failed machinery and listened. Guilliman was in the Sanctum Imperialis when it happened, having been moving toward it since Yvraine's warning, the custodians parting for him with an alacrity that suggested they had expected him or had been instructed to admit him. He stood at the base of the golden throne and looked up. The light was different, not brighter. Brighter was insufficient, was a category error, was trying to describe a symphony by measuring its volume. Different. It had quality and direction, and something that in any lesser source would have been called intention. The throne's mechanical components, those ancient life-sustaining systems that had operated in grinding, costly continuity for 10,000 years, were singing. A vibration below audible frequency that Guilliman felt in his enhanced skeleton rather than heard, the resonance of something vast warming itself toward action. The face above the throne, that ruin of transcendence that had been consuming itself in divine purpose for 100 centuries, moved. Not much, not in any way that a standard human observer would have registered as distinct from the subtle, organic shifts of sustained life. But Guilliman was a Primarch, built to perceive and process at capabilities beyond any unenhanced human, and he had stood in this room and looked at this face more times than he could count, and he knew the difference between the stillness of absence and the stillness of preparation. The Emperor was looking at him, not the generalized omnidirectional awareness of a psychic presence distributed across 1,000,000 worlds through the Astronomicon, not the indirect attention that the throne's changed readings had been suggesting for 11 days. Directly, specifically, the focused regard of a being of incalculable capability, choosing, for this moment, to be present in one place. Guilliman stood very straight. He did not kneel. He had not knelt since his resurrection, a decision he had made deliberately and had held to through every political storm that followed, because the Emperor Regent could not govern from his knees, and because, he had told himself in private, his father had never wanted sons who knelt when standing was possible. He was not entirely certain in this moment that he had been right about that, but he stood. The communication that followed was not language. It was not vision or image or any of the categories through which lesser psychic contact expressed itself. It was something that bypassed every mediating structure between intent and understanding, something that arrived complete and certain and overwhelming in the way that sunlight is overwhelming to someone who has lived in darkness. Not aggressive, not punishing, but simply more than any enclosed space could comfortably hold. Guilliman received it. He stood absolutely still for 63 seconds, which was how long it lasted, and then the quality of the light changed again, and the throne's readings began, slowly, gradually, in a pattern that the recovering Mechanicus instruments would later describe as unprecedented in its controlled grace, to stabilize. Not to their previous baseline, higher, more efficient. The psyker consumption figures, which the Mechanicus priests recalculated 3 times before trusting the numbers, had dropped by 1/3 in the first hour following the event. By morning, they had dropped by half. The Astronomicon, which had been burning at the same costly, grinding intensity since before any living human could remember, was burning brighter on fewer lives, which was either a miracle or a structural change in the throne's underlying operation, or both simultaneously, which in the 41st millennium was a distinction without practical difference. What Guilliman told his staff about those 63 seconds was precise, limited, and chosen with the care of a man who understood that some things lost meaning in translation. He told them the Emperor was aware. He told them the proclamation had not been opposed. He told them the throne's improvement was real and would continue. He told them there was work ahead that would require everything the Imperium had, and more. What he did not tell them, what he recorded in a personal document sealed to his authority alone, and filed in the deepest archive of the Ultramarines' fortress of Hera, to be opened only under conditions he specified with characteristic precision, was the full content of those 63 seconds. He did not tell them because it was not, in any meaningful sense, tellable. It was not a message or an instruction or a validation. It was something closer to what the theologians had always claimed, and Guilliman had always privately doubted, genuine contact with a presence that existed beyond the categories available to describe it, that was simultaneously the man he remembered and something that man had become through 10,000 years of a sacrifice so total it had changed what sacrifice meant. He did not tell them what the Emperor had communicated about his plans, about what the building throne energy had been preparing for, about what came next in the long, terrible, hopeful mathematics of a species that had survived everything the universe had thrown at it by the narrowest possible margins and showed every sign of intending to continue doing so. He kept that to himself, and he went back to work, and the Imperium turned on its axis, and the Astronomicon burned brighter. And somewhere in the webway, Magnus the Red felt the change in the throne's psychic signature, and was quiet for a long time. And in his sanctum in the Eye of Terror, Abaddon read the intelligence reports and adjusted his plans with the grim professionalism of a commander who had been playing a long game for 10,000 years and understood that long games had reversals, and across 1,000,000 worlds the faithful looked up at their shrine screens and their pulpit lumens and felt something shift in the quality of the light, and did not have words for it but recognized it anyway, the way living things recognize the end of winter before any external evidence makes it certain. Guilliman stood at the viewport of his strategium and looked at Terra and thought about a letter that had disappeared from the base of a throne, and about warmth, and about 11 sentences that had cracked the galaxy, and about a high marshal who had shaken his hand across a plain duralloy table, and about a chaos Primarch who wanted to pay a debt, and about the Void Inheritor's chapter master and his question about foundations. He thought about all of it for exactly 4 minutes. Then he turned back to his desk, because there was always a next report, and the galaxy did not pause, and he had work to do. The Imperium that emerged from those 11 days was not the Imperium that had preceded them. It was not better, not in any clean or uncomplicated way. It was scarred differently, fractured along different lines, sustained by a different architecture of faith and function that had not yet proven itself capable of bearing the weight being placed on it. The Ecclesiarchy's opposition did not dissolve. The theological questions did not resolve. The chaos pressure along the cicatrix, maledictum, did not relent. But the Astronomicon burned brighter, and the Golden Throne consumed fewer lives, and somewhere in the administrative machinery of a civilization that had been slowly dying for 10,000 years, something had shifted. Not enough, never enough in a galaxy this dark, but perceptibly, measurably. Roboute Guilliman had not saved the Imperium. He had done something harder and less satisfying. He had bought it time. Time to reform, to consolidate, to address the structural failures that had been accumulating since before he was placed in stasis. Time to become, perhaps, something worthy of the sacrifices made in its name. Whether that time would be enough remained, as it had always remained, the central unanswered question of human civilization in the 41st millennium. The enemies were real and eternal and patient. The internal fractures were genuine and deep and would not heal cleanly. The work ahead was larger than any one being, even a Primarch, could complete. But the Emperor had read his son's letter, and the light, for the first time in 10,000 years, was getting stronger. What came next was not salvation. It was a chance at it. In the 41st millennium, that is the closest thing to hope that exists. The Emperor protects. More stories await.